Normal and crosswind approaches and landings are used by pilots to return to the runway surface. Pilots practice approaches and landings to ensure they can safely and efficiently approach and land on a runway based on environmental conditions, such as wind and obstacles. Before a pilot begins to learn landings, they must familiarize themselves with the 4 phases of a landing. The first stage is a stable approach to the runway. This consists of a slightly nose-low attitude, appropriate power settings to maintain a controlled descent, and choosing an aiming point on the runway surface to fly the aircraft towards. Note, this is not where the aircraft will touch down, but where the pilot will begin the transition from the approach to the roundout to land. This aiming point should remain motionless on the windscreen. If the object begins to rise, the pilot is below their desired glide slope and must add power to gain altitude and return to the glide slope. If the object sinks lower on the windscreen or becomes obstructed by the aircraft's nose, the pilot is above their desired glide slope and must reduce the power to descend back to the glide slope. During this stage, the pilot should divide their focus between the aiming point, as well as the area between 45 degrees left of the pilot, between the window post and the runway. This allows the pilot to have depth perception as they enter the runway environment. The next stage of a landing is the roundout. This is when the pilot transitions the aircraft from a nose-low attitude from the approach to a level pitch before beginning the flare. As the pilot is about 20 feet above the runway, the pilot should raise the nose of the aircraft to the horizon as the aircraft begins to settle over the runway to maintain level flight. The aiming point used during the approach will now start to pass under the nose of the aircraft. They transition their eyes down to the end of the runway while still scanning 45 degrees to the left to maintain depth perception. A pilot can estimate their height above the runway by referencing nearby trees. They should be about half the height of the trees when entering the roundout. The pilot then reduces the power to idle and the aircraft will begin to sink towards the ground. As the aircraft begins to sink towards the ground, the pilot slowly and smoothly raises the nose of the aircraft to the horizon to begin the flare. The flare is when the pilot transitions from the level flight in the roundout to a nose-high attitude, preparing the aircraft to land on the main landing gear. The pilot should scan both ahead and 45 degrees to the left while flaring to maintain depth perception. As the nose of the aircraft continues to raise, the pilot will rely on their side view more as the instrument panel will block the view of the runway. Remember that during the flare, the airspeed is slowing, so there is less airflow across the flight controls, so they are becoming slowly less and less effective. The goal here is to transition from a level attitude to a nose-high attitude, and transfer the weight of the aircraft from the wings to the wheels at the slowest possible speed. The final stage of a landing is the touchdown or go-around. The pilot continues to scan both ahead and to the left of the aircraft as they prepare the main landing gear to touch down on the runway surface. As the plane gets lower, the more elevator back pressure is needed until the main landing gear touches down. If at any time the touchdown becomes unstable or unsafe, the pilot must conduct a go-around. Conducting a go-around from the flare is called a balked landing. This procedure should be practiced from the very first landings and regularly for the rest of a pilot's training and career. A pilot should always plan on the possibility of a balked landing and always be prepared to conduct this procedure and go around. A balked landing is an energy management maneuver pilots use when close to the ground. The pilot is transitioning the aircraft from low airspeed and low power settings in a slow descent to a full power condition at climb airspeed and a climb. In Epic Cessna 172s, the procedure for a balked landing and go-around are: smoothly apply full power, retract the flaps to 20 degrees, and pitch for 60 knots indicated airspeed. From this point, the pilot will transition to a normal climb, raising the flaps to 10 degrees only after the aircraft has demonstrated a positive rate of climb, with airspeed increasing past 65 knots. The climb transition will continue, and the pilot will bring the flaps up and climb out at VY airspeed, or another specific airspeed based on the climb out situation. To conduct stable approaches and landings, first, the pilot ensures the descent and before landing checklist has been completed. Then, they visually check for traffic on final, in the traffic pattern, and on the airport surface to ensure a safe landing is made and to remain situationally aware. Next, the pilot visually looks at the windsock to obtain the latest information about the wind prior to landing. This allows them to make the proper wind correction inputs needed while approaching and landing. The pilot must keep their hand on the throttle throughout the approach and landing to make small adjustments to remain on the glide slope and in case a go-around is necessary. Prior to 300 feet AGL on final approach, stabilize the airplane on the extended centerline with the final flap setting, and identify the aiming point on the runway that will be used during the landing. The pilot coordinates pitch and power to maintain 65 knots indicated airspeed and the desired approach angle that will permit landing within the designated area. Slightly higher approach speeds should be used under turbulent air conditions. If gusty conditions are present, increase final approach speed by 1/2 the gust factor. For example, if the winds are 10 knots gusting to 18 knots, there is an 8-knot difference between the constant and gusting wind velocity. The pilot divides 8 by 2 to get 4, and adds 4 knots to their approach speed. At the appropriate flare altitude, approximately 10 to 20 feet above the runway surface, the pilot slows the descent and begins the round out by raising the pitch attitude and smoothly reducing power to idle so that the airplane begins to settle onto the runway on the main gear. The pilot maintains elevator back pressure throughout the flare until the main landing gear touches down on the runway. They continue to maintain elevator back pressure on the landing roll to keep the nose wheel off the runway as long as possible for maximum aerodynamic braking. Eventually, the aircraft will not be able to generate enough lift to keep the nose wheel off the ground, and the nose wheel will make contact with the runway surface. The pilot then slows the airplane to normal taxi speed before leaving the runway centerline and clears the runway at the first safe taxiway intersection. Note, a pilot should always clear the runway at a taxiway intersection that will not impose significant side load on the gear, prevent skidding, and loss of directional control. If the pilot is unable to slow sufficiently and turn on the first taxiway available, they should continue down the runway to the next taxiway intersection. Never exit onto another runway unless instructed to do so by ATC. Once the airplane is clear of the active runway and stopped, the pilot then performs the after landing checklist. The pilot should apply an appropriate wind correction angle while on final by turning the aileron into the wind and applying rudder in the opposite direction. This is known as a side slip. For instance, if the crosswind is coming from the pilot's left side, they should turn their yoke to the left to raise the aileron nearest the wind, and apply right rudder to maintain alignment with the runway centerline and aircraft's longitudinal axis. It is normal for the wing nearest the wind to be lowered during the approach. During the round out and flare, the side slip is maintained to keep the aircraft's longitudinal axis aligned with the runway centerline. The pilot must appropriately adjust the aileron and rudder adjustment as the aircraft slows down in the round out and flare, and the control effectiveness becomes less. They continue doing so while the aircraft's upwind wheel touches down first. After this, the next main gear wheel touches down, and finally the nose wheel touches down. The pilot must maintain the necessary crosswind correction after the landing while on the ground roll to maintain the runway centerline. Some helpful tips when conducting normal and crosswind approaches and landings are: be wind conscious when landing by looking at the windsock or other wind indicator and turn the yoke into the wind. Remember, weather observations, such as METARs, are published once an hour and the winds can change before the next METAR is published. Be sure to adjust the approach speed based on turbulence and gust factors. A safe landing begins with a stable approach. Be sure to maintain a stable descent to the runway while remaining aligned with the centerline. If this is not possible, a go-around should be executed. Bug the runway heading on the heading indicator to ensure the aircraft is aligned with the right runway that the pilot is cleared to or plans to land on. Do not fixate only on the instruments and forward sight picture while landing, but incorporate scanning 45 degrees to the left to develop the best depth perception, which will allow the pilot to better gauge their height above the runway. As the pilot reduces the power in the round-out phase of landing, the aircraft will begin to sink towards the runway. This is when the pilot should begin to smoothly apply back elevator pressure to ensure the main landing gear touches down first. When landing with a crosswind, apply and adjust the appropriate aileron and rudder wind correction inputs to remain aligned with the runway centerline. As the aircraft slows, more wind correction inputs will be necessary, as there is less wind traveling over the control surfaces of the aircraft. Do not take out the wind correction inputs immediately after landing, as this will cause the aircraft to drift off the centerline. Leave the inputs in until clearing the runway. It is normal for the stall horn to begin to sound as the aircraft is about to touch down, as this is a sign that the aircraft is about to stop generating lift. Always be ready to conduct a go-around by keeping one hand on the throttle. If the landing does not look to be safe, or if an obstacle or another aircraft enters the runway environment, conduct a go-around immediately and notify ATC as soon as practical. Do not retract all the flaps on a go-around at once, as this will cause the aircraft to lose an excessive amount of lift. If necessary, land in a power-on configuration, leaving about 200 RPMs more than idle power in gusty conditions, and when learning how to land with crosswinds to assist in a smooth descent to the runway when rounding out and flaring. Communicate with ATC or the local traffic to ensure that everyone is situationally aware. When being evaluated by a progress check pilot or designated practical examiner, the pilot must maintain the appropriate approach airspeed, plus 10 or minus 5 knots while landing, and touch down within 400 feet of a specific point for private pilots. Maintain the appropriate airspeed, plus or minus 5 knots while landing, and touch down within 200 feet of a specific point for commercial pilots. Be sure to like our video and subscribe for more epic content. And while you're here, check out some of our more recent videos and playlists.